Hi, my name is Stephanie Flint, and I am a co-creator of Infinitus Publishing. And today I'm going to be doing a reading of Magic Stealing. I'm going to be doing Chapter 7. Also, if you haven't checked out last time, I did a reading of The Dragon's Tree, which is a short children's story that Isaac, my husband, and the other co-creator of Infinitus Publishing wrote. And in other news, hopefully not this time, but next time, I got a lovely Blue Yeti microphone for Christmas that I am hoping to use to improve the sound quality of these different video blogs. So hopefully next time you'll notice an improvement in sound quality. Should be a little bit more clear, less likely to have the popping noises or hissing s's. But we'll see. That's going to be a bit of an experiment because I haven't actually worked with one before. But other than that, I hope you enjoy the video. Well, recording. Chapter 7. Morning came, and Darren greeted Tirana with news that Starlight was tacked, the saddlebags were packed, and breakfast was on the table. Tirana yawned and stretched. Her muscles didn't ache so terribly now, and the headache had slipped away sometime during the night. Apparently the goddess's magic had come with faster recuperation. "Feeling better?" Darren asked, his eyebrows raised with concern. She nodded. "What about everyone else?" He grimaced. "It's worse for Siglana. I gave her a bit of magic when she first woke, but she's not doing too well." Tirana's heart sunk, and her eyes lingered on the crystal her sister had made for her. "Could you hand me that?" Darren followed her gaze, and did as she asked. Tirana twisted the smooth crystal in her hands, stroking the different faces and the rough edges where she dropped it on occasion. Hesitant, she felt out the crystal with her magic. Empty pockets floated where Siglana's magic once resided. She carefully pushed her own magic into those pockets, wrapping and tying the ribbons as Siglana had instructed. She had never really grasped those lessons then, but now that she could see magic, maybe she could do it properly. Make the crystal light like before. Siglana would like that. Tirana pursed her lips and mentally tied the final knot. She tugged at the ribbons. The crystal shattered. Darren yelped and raised his arm defensively. Shards flew into Tirana's lap. More clattered against the stone wall. She stared at the broken crystal, her shoulders slumped. Despite the automatic transfer of magic when healing people who had lost their magic, she was still terrible at commanding her ribbons. "At least you tried." Darren lowered his arm and eyed the pieces. He gave her a weary smile. She picked up a shard. "Sure. Like it did anything." "Did enough. You were willing to give it a shot." His smile widened. "If the crystals are still receptive, I can teach you once we get back tonight." She sighed and tossed a fragment over her shoulder. "If the crystals are receptive. And I'll need a new crystal." He shrugged and helped her gather the broken shards, including the one she'd tossed. He wrapped them in one of her old socks. "I'll toss this out when I go downstairs." "Go ahead. I need the change." Darren dipped his head in acknowledgment, and left her alone in her room. Ignoring the colorful ribbons that still floated around her head, she propelled herself through the familiar routine of exercises the Vineyard's Guard practiced in the morning. Afterwards she donned the breeches and tunic Darren had laid on her dresser. She shrugged a thin deer leather jerkin over her shoulders, and left her room. The hall smelled thick with candle smoke, but the furthest rooms were open, accompanied by a grassy, warm draught. The servants must have opened the windows to clear the stuffy air. Downstairs, Darren helped the servants gather the remains of breakfast, though one plate still contained a modest meal of ham and eggs. A customary basket of rolls sat at the center of the table, available to anyone who passed. Tirana took her seat. Her family hadn't yet left their chairs. Her mother stared at the wall. Her father pushed the uneaten bits of ham across his plate until a servant gingerly removed it with a soft apology. Since only a few of the servants had magic, it seemed most of them were up and running. But the room was far, far too quiet for her family's usual meals. Neither of her parents acknowledged her entry, and Siglana leaned against the mahogany table, her head in her hands. Her hair was damp as the back of her thin gown, unchanged from the night before. Sweat beaded on her forehead and behind her ears. Her skin was ashen, her fingernails a deep shade of purple. She breathed slowly, as if every breath was painstaking. Since Siglana had used magic the most frequently, it stood to reason that she was still recovering. Tirana eyed the silent group, unnerved, then returned her fork to her plate. She knew she needed food to keep her strength, but she couldn't sit by while her family suffered. She licked her lips. Her ribbons twisted and flickered with anticipation. Seeing magic was worse than being blind to it. If she couldn't see the ribbons, she could imagine they were a tool, dependent on the mage who called them to action. Now she couldn't. She shivered and went to Glana's side. Her gold healing ribbons glowed bright. She took her sister's hand and silently urged her magic forward. The ribbons surged through her hand and across Glana's chest, then simultaneously through her torso and head. Glana sighed contentedly. "Thank you." She looked up at Tarana, her brown eyes intrigued. A little bit of color had returned to her cheeks. She gave a faint smile. I didn't think you used magic." "You're not giving me much choice." Tarana patted her sister's shoulder, then did the same trick for her mother and father. Lord Cabanalana grunted and rolled his shoulders before looking up at her. "Darren said you still had magic. Are you all right?" Tarana nodded. "Yeah." "Good." He winced, then rubbed his temples. "Take it easy. Don't push yourself too hard." "There are books in the library, if you need them," her mother said softly. Tarana swallowed hard. Of all the people who still had magic, why her? Couldn't the gods have chosen someone a little more talented? She glanced at her sister, then returned to her seat. Once she finished breakfast, she told Lord Cabanalana she would be out for the day. He didn't make one remark about her improper attire, and he was already discussing plans with her mother to check with the priest, so she wasn't surprised that he didn't ask where she was going. She bit her cheek and hurried away from the dining room. Before the stealing, her father would never have let her disappear with at least some explanation of where she was headed. Tarana shuddered and closed his front door behind her, more than ready to leave the stuffy manor in return for clear blue sky, cheeping birds, and the already warm morning. Darren ran Starlight through paces on a line in the front yard. He waved to her, drew Starlight in beside him, and once they'd mounted the horse, they set off for the mountain forge. Riding was unusually difficult. Tarana's newfound sight meant seeing every ribbon that strayed from her side. She ducked and dodged as her ribbons flitted around her head, dancing like mist in the bright sun. Come midday, the mountain loomed across the expansive plain. The mountain was really just a large hill, but given the relative flatness of the surrounding land, it stuck out. They dismounted Starlight and tied his reins around a thick, leafy sycamore. A field of grass stretched between them and the base of the mountain. A hot wind caressed the greenery, turning the velvety leaves of the tree, and causing the sunlight to shimmer on the ground in golden patches. The day was sweltering. Tarana fanned herself with her hand. Her clothes were cool, but the leather jerkin left her back sweaty. Still, she valued its protection in the event that they got into a fight. She glanced at Darren. "You remember to pack food, right?" He retrieved 2 cloth bundles from the saddle-bag. The bundles were checkered with blue and purple stripes. Inside, Tarana found warm cheddar, an apple, and a hard roll. They ate in silence. The wind whispered against the restless leaves. A bird called overhead, spinning over the plain with dark wings as it searched for prey. Tarana cast a glance toward the distant mountain and shivered. The closer they came, the more her unease grew. It wasn't her usual dislike of magic. As close as they were now, the magic inside the forge glowed like a star. Yet the whole place was shrouded with a thick fog, a veil that kept the magic hidden from the distance. She frowned. She could almost see thin filaments weaving through the fog, like the shadows of strings from a poorly played puppet theater. The filaments lashed out in different directions, disappearing as they touched bright, sunlit sky. She tilted her head and squinted, but the strings vanished altogether. She shivered and returned to picking at the soft innards of her roll. There was something different about that magic. Wild, unsteady, like a foal that hadn't been broken, and might never be. The magic was curious, like a dark storm cloud spewing cracks of thunder and lightning when the rest of the land was gold. Tarana shivered. All this magic was bound to cause strange visions. So why was she drawn to follow? She looked up sharply. "What do you know about magic, Slur?" "What?" Darren lowered the last hunk of cheese for mid-bite. "Shouldn't we have come with some kind of guard, in case there's trouble?" Darren frowned. "If we brought guards, we'd be more noticeable." "We're nearly 3 hours from Vinya. A guard could stop here and we'd be reasonably under cover. More so because they don't have magic that's lighting them like a beacon." She bit her lip. "What if someone's calling us? Like how I touched that glass thing in the seer's shop?" Darren frowned and followed her gaze. It's possible. The mountain seemed foggier than before, lost in time and unreachable. Tendrils of mist climbed toward the hidden forge as they watched. Despite the heat of summer, a chilly, unnatural breeze swept past them. Darren froze, and Tarana reached for the short sword at her side. Darren stood quickly. You felt that? She nodded. She drew her sword and shifted into a fighting stance. A wisp of darkness fluttered just out of sight. Darren thrust his hand out, using magic to send a gust of wind that direction. There was a grunt, and the shadow vanished. I can barely see him, he said, hurrying behind Tarana so that they stood back to back. It was like a shadow, Tarana whispered. Oh, she really hated magic now. If magic had to be stolen, couldn't have had the convenience to take this magic too. Shadow, then. Show yourself! Darren raised his hands, and livid blue ribbons swarmed from his core to his palms. He had a knife at his side, though Tarana really hoped he didn't have to use it. He was about as competent with a knife as she was with light magic. She brandished her sword. Mortal blades cannot hurt us, a voice mocked. Distant, like eavesdropping through a thick wall. Tarana squinted in the direction of the voice. A faint man stood in the darkness. He looked as any man would, but faded, cloaked. Tarana. Darren touched her sleeve and pointed. Several more shadows stood behind them. I suggest we run. He sent another gust of wind in the shadow's direction, then sprinted toward the mountain. Wait! Tarana shouted. He was headed straight into danger. She started after him, then stopped as Starlight reared and smashed his hooves against a tree. The shadow approached her horse, sword in hand. Tarana cursed. She raced back and hacked at the reins. They broke loose as Starlight reared again. The shadow closed in, hunched as if Tarana might cast magic. She flashed her hands at him and the shadow jumped back. Then she grabbed the saddle horn and kicked herself into the saddle. Hi! Starlight obliged, taking off in a canter until she was fully mounted. Then he galloped, the wind tearing at Tarana's jerkin and stinging her face with her hair. Good boy, she told Starlight, breathless. Darren was well ahead of them. He'd taken the form of a sleek brown stallion. He could easily outrace Starlight, whose heavy stature and white feathering came from draft lineage. The horses raced along the rocky mountainside and up, as Tarana clung to Starlight's neck. He stumbled occasionally, but never fell, bits of rock spraying from his hooves off the side of the path. Once they reached a plateau, they slowed. They were just below the entrance of the cave. Darren returned to human form and collapsed against the stone's crags. What was that you were saying about magic, Slur? Tarana took a deep breath. We shouldn't be here. When we were attacked, we should have run back to Vinya Gard, not to the creepy mountain where we were probably going to be ambushed since we were very much not invisible as we ran in plain sight across the field. He frowned. I didn't notice a call. And I like with Ifa in the parade. Doesn't mean it wasn't there. Tarana crossed her arms. Goosebumps tickled her skin. They'd lost the shadows behind them, but now the air was chilly and thin, almost gray, as if she were looking through clouds. Above them, Tarana winced. Magic blazed from within the cave. What's wrong? Darren asked. It's bright. She clambered off Starlight and plopped on the ground beside Darren. The magic? Yes. His eyes widened, then he laughed. Have you been seeing magic this entire time? That's why you kept fidgeting earlier? What's so funny? He grinned and shook his head. You can turn off the sight, you know, or lower its strength. It's like a crystal. Have you tried? Tarana pursed her lips. She hadn't thought she might be able to control her newfound sight. She took a deep breath as she concentrated on lowering the luminosity. She glanced at Darren. Thick blue ribbons still fluttered around him, along with all the other colors. It didn't work. He tapped his chin, thinking, then let out a little aha of inspiration. Like a crystal, but inside you. You can't control it as an external force, it's internal. Oh. She tried again, and this time the magic disappeared. The world looked normal. No strange ribbons fluttering around and obscuring her vision. Better, she admitted. Thought that might help. But you might want to keep at least a little bit of it active, otherwise you might not see those shadowy people. Tarana sighed and renewed her magic vision. A few green ribbons danced in front of her nose, as if to thank her. She swatted them away. Once she and Darren were reasonably rested, they left Starlight on the plateau and stumbled up the mountainside. Stone steps jutted from the rock, leading to a cliff's edge that extended over the plateau and led into a wide cave within the heart of the mountain. They hadn't gone invisible, but Tarrano doubted that would help them now. They'd reached the forge.